We're just setting up the, turn the video on so the public can join us and we'll get going.
Officially live.
Thanks so much. Representative Mark Mahali, joining us this morning, and who's going to be our lead-off presenter. We thank you for coming down and leaving his committee and coming to our kind of denuded committee down here. So,
Great, you guys are doing this. Thank you.
thank you.
Mark Mahali, Callis Plainfield, Marshfield, and House General and Appropriations.
Right, and we're going to be talking today about H 772, which is an act relating to residential rental agreements, eviction procedures, and the creation of the positive rental payment credit reporting pilot program.
Right. So, controversial subject. But the reason it's controversial is because everybody's right. That's the problem. There's evictions for people who don't have enough money and can't pay rent, sometimes puts them on the street. And we don't have enough money to do everything that we could conceivably do for homelessness. On the other hand, we, unlike a lot of states, our landlords generally fall into two groups. We have the big, very large nonprofit landlords, like Champlain Housing Credit, for example, with thousands of units, okay? They operate under kind of federal rules because of their financing. So they don't evict people easily. And if they do, they have all kinds of programs that they can help them with. And it's almost a situation where it's very ordered. They won't just throw someone out because the lease is on the seven. But then we have most of our landlords are small businesses, and they operate on relatively thin margins. And one tenant who just says, I'm not paying, and stays or messes up their apartment or does drug deals in the hall can put them under. I mean, it's really, so what we have is a lot of landlords saying, I'm not doing this anymore, and exiting the business. And when that means less housing for the tenants. And so that's happening. And the nonprofits are facing a situation. It's really unfortunate, where they're dealing with drug dealers who take over apartments. They actually victimize the tenants. And the tenant is an addict, and they, play to that, and they can't get them out under existing law. It is unfortunately true, we are a bit of an outlier among states in terms of, we're an outlier among states in terms of how long it takes and how much it costs to evict a tenant. I mean, a lot of states take a third or half the time that we do. Okay, so what does this bill do? It's an attempt to balance the bill. It's an attempt at coming up with something that helps tenants and helps landlords. It's particularly aimed at helping tenants who are good tenants and are paying rent, but the landlord decides the lease is over, or I want to not renew the lease because I want to convert it for my family, or I want to sell it, or I want to completely remodel it, or whatever. In that case, it has a long notice provision. They've got to give 3 months notice, 90 days. And in addition, remember, this is the good tenant. In addition, 45 days before the expiration, they've got to do a walkthrough, and if there's no damage, give them half their deposit back. Because these people need cash to roll over into a new. See, what we're really trying to do is make it less conflict so they can actually get another unit and get out, so there's no need for eviction. There's a limitation on rent increases to once per year. You know what I'm going to do? I have a one-pager that I've scribbled all over it. I'm going to just send your clerk a one-page description.
Great.
Oh, and by the way, naturally, everything we do in the housing committee belongs in every other committee. It's just housing is that way.
Yeah.
So this bill, judiciary spent some time, and they've done a really good job, I think, And their amendment is going to be introduced on the floor. This is both their bill and our bill combined. Okay, it just shows you what it is. But to go on, there's $1 million for the rental arrears fund, which is a really good way of avoiding eviction. It pays up to 3 months or so rent for people who can eventually pay rent. You only qualify if you have the ability to eventually pay, but something bad has happened to you, like an illness or a problem that's a one-time problem. It's a bridge, kind of a bridge payment, goes right to the landlord. It's really good. It prevents homeless. It's a hell of a lot cheaper than motels.
Just a revolving type fund.
Yeah, no, they don't pay back. It's just a one time.
Okay.
And it's an existing program. It's just gonna run out of money in April. So, and there are other,
So that,
The
that was
biggest-
renewed, in other words,
What?
and that was renewed in the bill.
yeah. Then there's a provision which I would call is for tenants, although it's also for landlords, because there are interests in common. Actually. And this is an enhanced, fast process to deal with the drug use. To deal with someone whose continued presence is a danger to the health and safety of the tenants, other tenants, or the landlord or the landlord's agent. And it's very fast. We've tried to shorten the eviction process. There are currently no limitations on how long it takes. The courts tell us that their target is 6 months. And that 70 or 80% of the time they hit the target, but that's a long time. So we put in here that they have to set a hearing. It's heavily negotiated with the courts. They have to set a hearing within 90 days of the filing of the complaint. So it's a faster eviction process. And there's an enhanced trespass law to make it easier to deal with the tenant the non-tenant who is selling drugs in the hall, et cetera. And then we have other money in the bill, but I don't know what's going to go out of appropriations. But one is $200,000. Oh yeah, you guys passed it out. We passed out a credit reporting bill, and it's back in here. And it basically says people who pay rent, that gets on their credit report, which it doesn't now. So very often people who have no credit card, no nothing. The only thing they do is pay rent. This allows them to build a credit score. And if they blow it and don't pay, they're out of the program. So
I know that when we looked at the bill originally, there was a lot of discussion about the fact that if the person was participating in the program and they participated properly and paid the rent, they would get a report to the credit reporting agency that was a good report. But if they failed, or if they didn't pay rent or stopped paying rent, there was no credit report issued. And I know a number of people here has concern about that.
right, and now the way it works now is you don't pay rent one time, you're out. You're just out of the program.
And there's no reporting.
There's no reporting at all. Well, there's no reporting now, but there's no reporting. You just kicked out of the program. That's a quick summary. I will provide you guys the one pager that show, and I've tried to make sure that the one pager shows what's in both bills combined. Okay. So, but the bill that we pass out, if we pass it, it gets to the floor, and if we pass it out, the bill will be combined, and so that's what you'll see. But this
What was the bill number of the two bills in the House?
772.
770. Was there a second bill or just?
Yeah.
Okay.
The ways that the judiciary never took possession.
Okay.
They just did a elaborate flyby, and that will result in an amendment, floor amendment, which we will hear in a few minutes, here this afternoon.
Okay, so we could, so as we look at this, depending on how fast we look at it, before it becomes something to work with, we probably need to look at what you guys do as the amendment today.
Right, yeah, and this, and that's why I'm gonna give you this, because this, I will adjust this one pager to reflect both together.
Great,
Okay,
great, that'd be helpful.
anything else?
Anything else?
We would anticipate 772 will be on the floor today.
No.
Debate. No.
I think that first of all, appropriations has to hear it. They'll hear it. I believe they will hear it this afternoon. And then it will go on notice. And then Wednesday, maybe Wednesday. Okay?
Any other committees besides probes and judicial? Okay. Anyone else?
Proceed.
Thank you very much.
As the comedian, there's this old comedian long dead named Mort Saul.
Oh, yes.
One of my favorite sayings, he said, "The future lies ahead."
Thanks again.
Yeah, okay.
The next item that we have on the agenda is the report from Ledge Council. Ledge Council has gone upstairs to one of the folks that he had down, and so
Yeah.
until he comes back, I'm not sure there's a whole lot that you can do, because the purpose of today's agenda is to hear the introduction which we had from Representative Mahali, and then to go through the bill which Ledge Council will take us through. And the assurance that we had was that it would be 5 to 10 minutes at max. That he would be up in House Appropriations. He's had 5 of his 10 minutes. In the meantime, is there anything we should discuss right now, even though that may not be an agenda item, so they're going to be either coming to us or a result of what we did last couple of days that we should bring up for discussion with this committee?
We'll bring something up. So I did send an email. I don't think I see Senator Rahm or Senator Weeks, but Senator Brock, this is in your inbox. I'm going to propose an amendment to the cannabis bill on Tuesday of next week, which would effectively enact on one of the recommendations that we called for last year, the Cannabis Control Board. This is a report from the CCB that James Pepper highlighted. That would effectively, I would argue, recalibrate outdoor cultivators' fees. They have produced a sixth as much crop, but they are charged on full currently $8,400 for Tier 3 license, and that just seems out of step with also the impact on the natural environment that we, through other policies, have been compensatory towards. So I think considering a recalibration of outdoor licensing fees is something that's worth considering.
Was that recommended in the report that the Cannabis Control Board?
It's framed as a consideration. So they cite Colorado Energy's office about the estimated cost of outdoor cultivation versus indoor. So I don't see it as the word recommendation, which I do see in the second one. So I think they walked the line because it would result in a revenue reduction of about $120,000. So this won't necessarily, what I'm going to report, fill that hole. I don't have the answer for that. I do expect if this committee supports it, then it'll be a floor amendment. I think we'll have to have this conversation in finance and then also pros, and then side conversation with the appropriations chair. I think will be concerns raised if we're going to reduce our revenues by $120,000.
We did an amendment like this, as I recall, last year. And I don't remember what the revenue impact was of that. Did you?
Well, I was always uncomfortable because that one raised other
Yes, it did.
fees, so it was revenue neutral,
Yeah.
but we didn't talk to any of the people whose fees we raised. So I was more comfortable cutting it. Only in the sense that I believe when we were having that discussion, the CCB still took in all their money and used what they needed and then remitted the rest to the general fund. Now, given how we count our beans here, this creates $120,000 hole, so that's different.
Well, I know we took testimony last year, which we can certainly review. Again, it's up to you as to whether or not we should actually bring people in from both sides of the picture and take a bit of testimony at least beforehand, both to refresh our memory and also to see if anything's changed. The question of the lost revenue is something that I would think would hear from the Accountants Control Board as to what the impact of that would be and how would they suggest making, necessary making,
Okay, so James Pepper's fully aware of this, so if he's gonna be part of that, so having hearing from him would be, I think, useful. Since it's not gonna propose to raise indoor cultivators fees to fill the hole, I don't expect much opposition. I'd be happy to see for him. I just expect.
no, I would expect not, but I would expect that if you did raise somebody else's fee to make up the difference, that's what's here. I don't recall last year, did we get any testimony, substantial testimony from, those large, indoor cultivators whose fees would have gone up in proposal last year? Do you recall that testimony?
Yeah, there is a handful. I think there's, I mean, it's maybe like less than 5. So, I think we know who they are. I don't remember anyone else.
I don't know.
To me, this is worth the conversation because outdoor cultivators have a really rough go at it.
Yeah.
If the weather and the climate.
And it typically are the smaller cultivators who are suffering the most from this. And one of the objectives of the legislation, some of the purpose statements that I've seen, is to promote the small growers so that they can have a competitive place in the picture. And that's one of the questions that are raised, is that the fee structure is such that it makes them less competitive, less able to survive in many cases.
So any other agricultural crop, we charge a fee of $8,400 just to grow it. You know, I mean, so I'm fine with charging a fee for cannabis, but I mean, do we do that on grapes or tobacco grows in Vermont? It's
Is
just
that an idea that you're suggesting for the rest of agriculture? Be popular.
Yeah, no, my point is it just seems out of step with what we do with other agricultural products. So that's,
I'm not aware of any people.
that's so
It's though, but most of our grapes don't have quite as stringent a regulatory issue to deal with that has to be managed and somebody's got to pay for it. So that's the balance point. But
So, I mean, are you
Got
gonna
it,
try and
but-
have JFO look at making up the difference?
This is how I was gonna propose this. I requested the amendment. I was planning for Tuesday as a discussion. I think that works with how the calendars unfolding. And if this committee does support it, then I was gonna go the next step and talk to JFO and finance. But if this committee is not ready to sign on to this, I don't think it's worth.
well, the other thing that I'm thinking of is from a time standpoint, we're pressed for time. I gather that from talking to leadership, I understand that this may be postponed a day or two if necessary in order to have sufficient time to deal with it. I don't know that fact. But nonetheless, if we want testimony from JFO, so I think probably gonna be wise to give them the heads up today, so that they aren't pressed for trying to do something like this very last minute.
Yeah.
I think I CC Ken Barnett, but I will get that email to him now.
Okay.
I was gonna say, if we don't have other things on the agenda.
I sent it last night to Tucker. I don't know if it's ready to be reviewed. Once.
The Senate calendar question, we have new business S 327, which is the Economic Development Committee. The reporter is Senator Gordon.
We have those two bills for her. And I notified the secretary's office yesterday that she is out of town until Tuesday and requested that it be passed over.
She did request, I was gonna say,
One of them,
thought she requested.
Well, she may have, but I, didn't see that they knew it when I talked to
the
her
House
yesterday.
Development. Economic Development.
That's my understanding. But they had. The folks
Oh,
I
right,
talked to
okay, I see.
weren't aware of that until I spoke with them.
Right.
So that's going to be for public on Tuesday.
Good. So we have nothing up on the calendar today from our,
No, not, that's my knowledge, issue, not looking at today's. And side, 327. And those bill of hours. that was there
I think I
also.
think I missed that, so we're not doing 327 today.
No, that's going to be passed over.
We're center parts. Okay.
327 will be passed over to Tuesday. I thought there was another bill on yesterday.
328 is also showing on notice yesterday.
And
Yeah,
two,
that's
seven,
it.
eight,
And it's now on the 328 is on the notice calendar today.
right,
And it was, I don't quite understand that because I saw it on notice calendar yesterday,
Right.
on the 327. So I don't know what they did to apply.
that's not to try and progress. And I mean, I think our committee has an interest in S325, which will be up next week because it's, you know, if it was me, I probably would have asked Natural Resources to come talk to us about S325 only because it modifies Act 181, which originated in this committee last night.
Isn't that the bill, 325 that Senator Watson would be here first in the week?
No, Senator Watson will be here for the amendment of S 328
Okay.
that you went to the committee about yesterday.
Oh, yeah, I can talk about that if you forgot about that.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
So, yeah, she'll be here on Wednesday
Yeah.
for hopefully a potential committee vote on the amendment.
So I'm happy to try and talk about both a little bit.
Sure. Well, we have the time right now.
Yeah.
We're waiting for the councilor back.
Okay, I didn't know if we were stalling or what.
No, we're
Okay.
waiting. Basically, he had
Yeah,
a thing in House Appropriations as well, which
Yeah.
he announced as he arrived here this morning that they were pressing him. So since we didn't have anybody from the committee to tell us the background of the bill,
yeah,
I invited Representative Holly
Right.
down here to
Right.
give us that basic of the understanding that Cam would do his best to get back here in about 10 minutes, which is what he thought it would take.
okay. So I'll talk quickly then.
Okay.
So the Natural Resources did not ever possess 328, our housing bill, but they did want to look at it for our agreed upon shared jurisdiction around municipal water sewer regulation. They looked at our piece about the 2,000 feet on either side of the road for waters for ensuring that quadplex can have the same access to water sewer hookup that a single family home would have received. They heard from the LCT and the municipalities kind of again what we heard from people like Chip Sawyer and others who came to us with options. I guess they didn't like that we chose the option of 2,000 feet from the road. So they talked a lot about different numbers of feet, but I think where they are landing is trying to harmonize the number of feet from a road with whatever the community is already allowing for in that area, and strengthen the language on the non-discriminatory piece that you can't prohibit that water sewer hookup that is on the road simply because you don't like the number of units or the project, simply because of the units of housing rather than that it is a housing project.
Does that mean that they would look at taking whatever limit they have now and continue to use it, but if it got rezoned from single family to quadruplex, that number would still remain the same?
Well, it's essentially saying that anywhere you have water and sewer, which is 41 square miles that we have it, you don't get to zone single family. You right now, you don't get to zone single family anywhere because of the duplexing by right anywhere.
Yep.
But we're now saying, which is what we said in the original comment.
Yeah.
Along water and sewer, you need to be able to allow quadplexing by right because it's a precious resource that we only have in very few parts of the state. And then we proceeded to have municipalities try to understand what we mean by that, have, pre-litigation conversations about what we mean by that. So this is our next attempt to define what we mean by along water and sewer. And so I don't know exactly where they've landed on all of the language, but they did not want to use a specific number of feet. They at first did. They tried to use a quarter mile because they looked at our housing exemption and saw that we have a quarter mile around village centers. So they understood our effort to harmonize. But they're looking at another way of harmonizing. And I mean, personally, I don't have qualms with that effort. We've just been trying to get this right and not have municipalities have expensive fights about what it means to say, you know, more density along water and sewer, where otherwise single family density would have been allowed.
But by not defining it, you have the potential of having 261 different fights.
Yes, that's how I always feel. That's what I always worry about. But I guess the response that one could give is that we would have that anyway,
Yeah.
because we can say to them, we're expanding here what you've already debated to be 500 foot, you know, allowance on this side. And we had some testimony that, you know, they have one side of the street that's a view shed,
Right.
that they don't allow any housing. I still feel like that should be clear enough that if you're not allowing any housing on one side, we're not asking you to do quadplexing on that side of the road. Wherever you allow other types of housing, you need to allow quadplex. But, and by the way, I don't know if people saw the Washington Post article about Portland, Oregon today. I'll send it to you. Can you find that? Do you guys have like a Washington Post subscription access thing for like different?
Not that I know of, but I can find it to you if you need.
I'll text you the title of the article.
Yeah.
You may not be able to find it because Washington Post is
It's real locked down.
newspapers that's protected.
I thought we had like some kind of LexisNexis thing.
We might just not privy.
I used to subscribe to it and I get about 50% of the articles now.
Well, I just say like if people, you know, people have balked at when we've talked about, you know, small housing projects and how they can really change things.
Mhm.
People balk at Minneapolis because that's mostly apartments. That's like 15 to 20 units and that doesn't fit most of our character, quote unquote, in the state. People balk at Houston or Austin because we're just not Houston or Austin. But Portland, Oregon, you know, great article on how they have lowered the cost of ownership of duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes by building in backyards and, you know, really fitting it into the character of bungalow type neighborhoods, which Portland, Oregon is known for. So, you know, seems like another great touchstone for people who have balked at the Midwest or elsewhere, but another, you know, very liberal city that doesn't want to change its scenic.
It's not on page one, referenced on page one today.
It's called Lots of Cities Need Affordable Housing. Portland found the secret to building it. I found it online, like I don't know.
I actually see it.
Um,
What section was it in? You know?
Looked like some kind of special interest type of thing.
Another thing that brings Senator Rahm up to speed on from our discussion yesterday, planning on Tuesday for a tobacco amendment to come from this committee, reinstating one of the pup laws. So basically still make it a consequence if somebody presents a big ID underage. So I think the chair is on an email thread with that too, and seems supportive of it.
Right. That's been updated. So S325, I think I just recycled all of the summaries of it, but I think we're trying to work for one for the floor, but you may know unanimous vote out of Senate Natural Resources should be up on Tuesday. Not sure actually. And it extends all of the deadlines from Act 181, some anywhere between 2 to 4 years. And it extends our housing exemptions for 4 years, which I was grateful for. And then I think
That's true. It was too tight, right?
it was
When we passed.
too tight.
Yeah, it's ours.
And it's working, so that's exciting. And it pushes out the road rule 4 years, and gives a harder look at tier 3. And it tries to give the LURB more flexibility over these next few years as they are in this iterative process with the RPCs and the municipalities. much more flexible process to allow them to narrow any any new Act 250, amendments or permits that they might need to deal with, and to really narrow tier 3 period. That's the important part. That, if we know tier 1, because it's water, sewer, because it's big infrastructure, is about 1 to 2% of the state. They're looking at matching that in tier 3, that really honing in on very ecologically sensitive areas, places where building probably isn't a good idea anyway because of slope and ledge, etc. And reducing what tier 3 looks like on the map.
One thing that I would like to see we can construct is some type of a measurement mechanism that shows in certain kinds of new construction by tier how long it takes from beginning to end. In other words, a timeline. To know whether or not we're actually making progress,
Right.
or whether it's just as slow as it always was, but now more complicated,
Right.
which is a concern to me.
Yeah, that way, that's a good point, but I'm trying to think if we heard specifically kind of housing exempt projects that have benefited from the 50 and 75 unit cap. I believe so, but I worry that it's not spread out as much in the state as we would like it to be. It's very, right now it's still just very hard to get a multi-unit project off the ground outside of Chittenden County.
Well, that's something that we should perhaps think a little bit about as this is going along, is that periodically bringing in people to testify
Yeah.
about what's the permitting process like.
Right.
Is it faster or slower?
I thought it was really helpful when we talked to, I loved that guy. He was like the town manager of Fairleigh or something. And he basically said, the land use review board has not been here to my community. They made, they didn't let us do tier 1A or B in an area that has our water sewer infrastructure, essentially. So a lot of this really is natural resources been trying to figure out from the LURB, where do you feel constrained by what we did, such that you're having such disagreements with municipalities and regions about, what they see on the ground as their potential for opportunity. And I bring up Fairleigh because it's around where Jonah Richards is, who's someone we brought in almost annually to talk about like 4 to 10 unit developments in Orange County.
Well, I think it's the issue of doing more outreach for people who have experience
Yes.
with the regulatory bureaucracy, if you will, at various stages of development. And it's sort of like throwing a net out of how hard or easy was it for you to build a house, set up a trailer, a mobile home, or to create a multi-unit or
I'd love
development.
to check in with I think it's the town manager in Fairhaven who spoke at the CHIP press conference about, I thought of that project as we've done every single bill. I said that at the press conference is, that is the perfect home ownership, 50 units, racetrack next to a very desirable neighborhood that they, everyone's hoping our 3 bills combined would help that site. And I'd love to know how that's going.
What I'd like to know is in various towns, people, businesses, organizations who have inquired about or at least started the process, building a house or development, and then stopped.
Yep.
To talk to those people who are inclined. I think that's really important. Or people, who have written a letter or whatever.
Right.
Expressing interest, but have not followed up. Why?
I think we should also talk to Killington. I don't know if we feel like we've heard enough from Devin Neary, your regional planning commissioner, but Rutland went first with the land use review board, and they now feel like they've learned a lot from that experience. But I wrote a letter to the Land Use Review Board in support of Killington getting 1A designation. It is its own center. So, you know, sometimes we're, I mean, these things happen mostly when we're gone, right? We're not here for construction season. And if they lose that season, they lose a year. So, you know, there are definitely things that have stopped.
The things that gave, but Killington in a position to receive the designation that it did, which seemed to be unusual for area that type or size.
Well, I will say since we did Act 181, during the time we were doing Act 181, the ski areas wanted to make sure there was some opportunity for them to be considered for that density designation, because their goal is to try and build densely and build their own water sewer. So, you know, I think it's been 2 years since we heard in committee from Killington about wanting to build 300 workforce housing units and, you know, take advantage of any programs on infrastructure that we could support them with, and that they're investing hundreds
So
of
are you
millions of dollars.
suggesting that over the next 5 weeks that we hear of Killington, Devon Neary,
Fairhaven, Jonah Richards, I mean,
Yeah, exactly, we can, and our time is very free right now, this minute, this second.
yeah,
But it's gonna get eaten up again by all the stuff that's gonna come in from elsewhere, plus the reviews of these combined bills. But this is something that we ought to do, and we ought to do now if we can do it. If not, there's some in-depth stuff that
yeah,
we should do to see how well what we
right,
thought we did actually, how it in fact got done,
Right.
and where there are obstacles to that
What
also
you-
is something we should periodically do during the off season.
I think,
extent that we have-
yeah, I mean, I think, so my bill was, I think, S305 that went to Metro.
One second, could you give a call to House Appropriations and see how we're doing with Representative so-and-so? I just emphasize to them that our committee had been scheduled today. We are waiting at length for him to
Yes,
here to testify.
I'm teaming with the committee assistant and with Cam right now. I just asked for the time estimate. He's giving that to me as we speak.
Tell him we're gonna hear his testimony without it, otherwise.
S305, so every year, so I don't try to keep it in my head, I've tried to start drafting a bill of all the problems I've heard about people facing that stop their projects. And for better or worse, I think mostly for better, a lot of people in the state know you're the person to like CC as we deal with, you know, our district manager in Act 250 or our municipality or A&R. So I think I said this at the beginning of session, A&R is still a big one.
Well, yeah,
We haven't really
this is been my experience as well,
Yeah,
that it's one of the largest roadblocks is the administrative capability of A&R to be able to deliver. And the question is, what's the, you know, this is again, in terms of legislative inquiry,
Mhm.
why?
right.
To bring people in who can report on the issues
Mhm.
that are affecting them, slowing down their projects, and
Yeah.
stopping in place, and to find out why is it happening? Is it bureaucracy? Is it a lack of staff? What is it?
Well, I would just go back to that visual that you always highlight, which I would love to spend more time on this, which is permit, layers and layers of permitting
Mhm.
across multiple agencies and the municipal, the state.
Every single one has an appeal.
That's a problem. And the appeals that I was more optimistic going into the session that we're going to take heart on. It seems that what came from that report was nothing that I would support. So I don't know where that appeals discussions landed. Not faulty.
Maybe we can add another exemption because those are the only things that can't be appealed right now. Correct. We can, I mean, that, you know, for folks who weren't here, we were looking at many things. And then we said, we need really strong exemptions right now while everyone argues about this. We could look to see if there's another interim exemption that we need to, you know, put in more rural places. I mean, I really struggled with was we had a big fight about 1055. So in places like tier 2, where we're supposedly leaving the status quo, I think that pushes developers to look for opportunities for bigger homes, bigger single family homes. 1055 says you can only build, you could build under 10 units within 5 years, within 5 square miles. That's sprawl to me. I've never understood what that does to help us. And Jonah Richards was one of the people who really pushed back on that because he wants to be a small town developer. Like everything on HGTV is like, let's fix up all these, small.
That is arbitrary. It's independent of how large the parcel is. So I can show you around
Yeah.
Pleasant Street,
Yeah.
Shelburne, there are 10 houses on almost, I want to say 15 acres.
Exactly.
That's like terrible development.
Simply
Yeah.
create a different corporate entity, in order to circumvent
Right.
that very easily, I would think.
I mean, you know how hard it is to do anything and not get appealed back to 50. So they've often, I mean, we know that usually what happens is you just see a 9-unit project that they have to get their margin somewhere instead of doing a 25-unit project that's more affordable for people.
Yeah, it would fit the landscape.
Yeah. Let's do it. Like, I can tell you a whole list of big stuff that people right now that I think are eminently solvable, or we should experiment with what solutions like.
I would think with Army, for-profit and nonprofit organizations that are dealing with housing, we should have heard some of this. But
I could tell
they
there
were
were,
be a list, if you will,
yeah,
not necessarily organized,
right.
of people certainly who
Uh,
written and pointed out the issues
Yeah.
that are delaying their ability to.
I did give the chair a list of developers who are trying to do 4-unit project. I mean, they're trying to just use the quadplex thing so that, it's like they just want to build exactly what Portland is doing. A couple units in someone's backyard in Montpelier. And I miss Bill Frazier, the former city manager for Montpelier, because all of our VLCT members are saying, we need something that lets projects under 15 units happen more easily. That's how we're going to get housing here. How we're going to get housing. So I could absolutely make a list. Of a lot of the developers who'd love to talk to us about this is exactly what stuff is. So, we should talk to our environmental court judges. I mean, there was a whole effort to move all of the appeals away from the environmental court after we just asked them to hire a new environmental court person to make that go faster. And my conversation with them was just trying to say, how do we decide that something doesn't even need to be heard as an appeal? Why do they get standing to appeal when we've said that's a by right use? So I try to dig into all of this stuff in my non-existent free time. But I would love to have those conversations in here.
Cam is heading this way now.
Okay, good. Thank you.
If someone gave me a couple days on housing.
I have the impression before we joined this committee, that's what you did spend a lot of time on previous years. Is that correct? So those are conversations I
We
would
didn't spend enough time. If we spent enough time, we've solved the A&R problem. And some of that problem is, I think, got to go to the issue of yelling and screaming. Because the answers that we're getting have not been comforting to me at all in terms of responsiveness.
I think some of the conversations with leaders within A&R are going a lot better.
Good.
I think we have to do that joint with A&R, natural resources. I wanted to get up and actually celebrate the whole wastewater, transfer of authority to municipalities. We've been trying to solve that for several years, but the wastewater division in A&R is highly functional. They are getting permits out in a month, and they are now saying, you know what, it doesn't make sense for us to require a $1,500 engineering design for someone to duplex their house. So they are looking at ways to give that to municipalities as a more of a technical permit that's topped $100. So
It would be great provided, that it's done in a timely fashion. And the issue that I hear about A&R and committee, as much as anything else, is just responsiveness.
So
and clarity.
wastewater is the only, they can almost tell you they get almost everything done in less than a month, and they're very responsive to people.
But the rest of A&R.
Wetlands, which if we want to bring in the wetlands team, that's where they say to people, well, you just need a new wetland delineation. Okay, that's $20,000. Why doesn't A&R have a wetland delineation? And how does a wetland all of a sudden get created somewhere?
And on wetlands, but just make it right. The city of South Burlington that I love has enacted 100-foot buffer on wetlands, which is arbitrary and not based in science. So you go half a mile to Shelburne and it's what the state has, which is 25 or 50 foot.
It's 50 foot and we want to bring it down to 25.
I would argue that South Burlington is inappropriately using wetlands law to suppress growth in one of the most wealthy areas of the city and state. And that's where I think we need to take a closer look at a lot of these regulatory enablers at the local level. That came up previous year.
Yeah.
I think it's a good discussion. It pointed out a number of things that we need to do, and perhaps we should write down some of those things that we need to do and figure out how to get time other than dealing with specific pieces of legislation. Some of these areas, but all just sort of tangentially. But we don't really have a process to look at the underlying core problem and to say, how do we fix that? If nobody presents us with a piece of legislation that does it.
I've just been asking A&R to come in here and tell us what they are doing and not doing.
And
We
how
can do that
fast,
with,
how slow are they? What are the things that are slowing down
yeah,
those processes and what can speed them up?
all written down.
As you're more
The chair gets back, that's one of the things that we should raise, and we should have one or more sessions or days focused on improving the processes. And what's taking so long to get things done and identifying and then look at
Yeah.
action plan.
And I actually, I had a conversation with the chair of natural resources with A&R for out of session about, could they tell us where they are low on staffing and what that's doing? Could we actually start talking about fees again? Because we hear from people all the time, they would pay for speed.
Mhm.
You know, not
Because they are
jump
paying
in
for-
line.
they're
They're paying for
for
slow,
speed right now.
exactly. So, there's they would pay a fee that guaranteed them a reasonable, concrete answer in less than 3 months.
Let's go back to this issue where we have the time to do it or making the
Yeah.
time to do it, but we now have Ledge Council with us today. It's going to explain everything about the bill that we heard about from Representative Mahoney.
Good morning. Cameron Wood, Office of Legislative Counsel. I will start with apology for the runarounds. It's that time
It's not
of
your
year.
fault.
And I had to go into House of Probes for a vote.
So for page 772, we started the end. What was the committee vote as it came out of it?
As it came out of House General,
Yes.
I believe there were 3 against. And I believe it's a committee of 11, so I believe it was 8-3. I don't think there were any individuals not present, so I believe it was 8-3.
to that point, it's on the floor now with an expected judiciary event. No, it's not.
Oh, it's just not on the floor yet. My apologies, sir. Go ahead.
So without a committee, it's
So the first caveat is it is sitting in appropriations.
Oh, okay.
So it's not even on the floor. And you have the report of the General and Housing Committee, which I have in front of me, and I'll use it as kind of a little bit of a guide to start walking through this issue. I'm not even sure.
4-4.1,
yes.
now.
Yes, sir. Not even sure we'll get through all of this, this morning. It went from House General to Appropriations directly, and Appropriations has not voted the bill out at this point. They would need to do so by today. The House Judiciary Committee has continued to work on certain aspects of the bill. And the chair of that committee has an amendment that they are now on 5. The last version that I walked on that committee was 4.1. So they have been going through multiple different iterations of certain aspects of the bill that would change the ejectment process. And so I can kind of, if we get to there, I'll kind of speak to that a little bit, but just understand that, as you all know, I think appropriations anticipates voting it out today, given all the work that's gone into it. But, if they did not, then the bill would not have made crossover. Okay. So before I, kind of jump into the language here, I was going to spend the first bit of time just walking through the residential rental agreement chapter, but, and given where we're at with time, I might save that for when we potentially come back. That way we can at least just jump right into the language and you can start to see what some of the changes are. But I will just at the outset, for those who may not be familiar, just kind of understand the global process that we're talking about here. Individual enters into a rental agreement with a landlord to rent a dwelling unit. And that's process, the process of entering into the agreement, what the agreement can and cannot include, what are the obligations of the tenant, what are the obligations of the landlord, how do you terminate that agreement, what are the rights and the remedies of the parties to the agreement. All of that is governed by Chapter 137 and Title 9, which is about residential rental agreements. The first thing that happens when you're talking about, unfortunately, we're having to address the unfortunate circumstance where the agreement is being terminated because of some reason. The first thing you have to look at is the residential rental agreement chapter related to termination of a rental agreement. And depending on the reason that the landlord is terminating the rental agreement, and depending on how long a person has lived at that location, will depend on what notice the landlord has to provide to the tenant. You have to provide a certain time frame to say the rental agreement will expire or terminate on this date in the future. And you have to provide a certain number of days. So the first half of this bill is dealing with that aspect of the landlord-tenant relationship. Separate from that, if the landlord has terminated the rental agreement and the individual tenant remains in the location after the date where the agreement has been terminated, the landlord then has to bring an ejectment action against the person to essentially have them evicted from the property. The statute doesn't use the term eviction, it uses the term ejectment. But just understand that there are two separate processes that we're going to be dealing with as you all move this bill forward, if you so choose, and you're hearing from the stakeholders and you're figuring out which aspects of the bill you potentially want to amend, assuming it gets here. There's the first part where you terminate the agreement, and then second from there, the landlord would then have to bring the ejectment action to actually have the individual removed from the property if the individual stays after the termination of the agreement.
So you were very careful with that terminology. Is there an ejectment process and an eviction process that would be known? Why do we need to call it ejectment when I just know it as eviction?
The statute calls it ejectment.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know why that word versus eviction, but that was one thing I just wanted to, as I talk about it, if I talk about an ejectment, that's what we're referring to.
Is it defined specifically in the same way?
It's not defined, like the word ejectment isn't defined, but just the sections and when we get to it, you'll see like the process of you have to go into court, you have to file the complaint, the answer. If the landlord ultimately wins, and there's different motions that can be filed depending on the circumstances. If the landlord ultimately gets a judgment that they are entitled to lawful possession of the property, they would get a writ of possession. And then the sheriff would have to serve that writ of possession onto the tenant, the defendant. And then within a certain period of time, they let the defendant know you have this amount of days, and then I, as the sheriff, will be back. And if you are still here at that point, the locks will be changed, you will be physically removed. So just the ejectment process is really the eviction and how that happens. And then at the very end of the bill, there is the credit reporting pilot program with the Office of the State Treasurer. You all may remember, you all did a lot of work on that last year, and the current version of that is as it was last with you all. But I'll be happy to kind of walk through and reorient when we get there. But given most of the attention is on the landlord aspects of this bill, I think some people may forget that that's in there, but it is. And so we can talk about that when we get there. But okay, for starters, Kira, I just sent a request to share, if you don't mind. And there we go. Okay, so again, this is the bill as it came out of as it's recommended to be amended by the General and Housing Committee. First, we're dealing with residential rental agreements. This first piece here is actually really critical. It's a definition of actual notice, and it kind of is very key when you're teeing up, what happens when a rental agreement is terminated. The landlord has to provide actual notice of the termination to the tenant. And actual notice there on lines 14 means receipt of written notice. So two key things there. It has to be in writing, it cannot be verbal. And the individual has to have received it. And currently, there's only two ways that a landlord can provide actual notice. It's by hand delivering it to the individual or mailing it to the last known address. So you can see it there on lines 15 or line 17. And this proposal would add a few other methods of providing service. So it could be delivered by sheriff, mailed to the last known address or the address provided in the residential rental agreements. It could be emailed to the email address included and mailed as described in sub 3. So if you're going to email it, you also have to mail it. Then when you get to the top of page 2, if the last address is unknown, it could be posted on the door of the dwelling. So it can only be posted if you don't have that address. So then the sub B here, so when you think about, as I mentioned, number 1A, actual notice means receipt. So when the landlord ultimately goes in and brings an ejectment action against someone later way down the line, the landlord's going to have to demonstrate that they provided the tenant with actual notice and the tenant received the termination letter. So that's, a key piece. You get all the way to the court case and the defendant tenant could say, I never received the termination notice. And so the landlord's going to have to prove that.
Comes to mind as I look at mail to the last known address or the address provided in the residential rental agreement, particularly the residential rental agreement, the person is moving to that address. That's the address that's going to be on it. If they're doing from their address because they are going to move to this new apartment that they've rented 2 weeks from now, it's the address that they've left. We think that presumably it's going to be the address that's on there, and that would be very worthwhile either.
Potentially, this is a question that I would advise you to pose to some of the practitioners. I imagine you'll hear from some of the witnesses that have testified throughout, all committees that well, I should say not all, judiciary and general have heard from landlord parties and entities and individuals that represent tenants. And a question for them. I know you can imagine circumstances where, for example, some individuals may decide to use a PO box as opposed to a physical address. And so this would cover under those circumstances. But yes, sir, Mr. Chair, you're right. I mean, presumably the last address you're giving somebody before you take over that address is somewhere where you may not be. But there are some hypotheticals conceivably where it would make sense.
Yeah. So they're renting something that's residential.
Presumably they're living there.
Purpose, but not necessarily.
And then about another one could be, if you have a guarantor, for example, like the guarantor may be at a different address. So then you get to the B, and this is key because, as I mentioned a second ago, the landlord's going to have to demonstrate that the individual actually received the notice. And well, how do you prove that someone receives a notice if you mail it to them? And so the sub B here, and part of this is an existing law, there is a rebuttable presumption the notice was received. Currently, it's 3 days after it's mailed if you mail it first class or certified mail. So the landlord gets to go into court and say, there's a presumption, I mailed it to you first class mail. Here's the documentation of where I mailed it first class. You received it 3 days after that. And then the tenant defendant would have to rebut that presumption and demonstrate that they did receive it that way. So what this is doing is it's adding a few rebuttable presumptions in here. So, the date the email was sent, if it's sent via electronic means, and the date the notice was posted to the door are being added into this rebuttable presumption. And then it's extending the rebuttable presumption out 5 days. There was some concern in the House General and Housing Committee about the current delays with US postage mailing. And so they felt extending it from 3 to 5 was appropriate. Okay. So moving on, there is a definition here of immediate family that's going to come up later on and be relevant. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on it right now because I'll reference back to it when we get to where it is relevant. I'll just comment, it's an expansive definition. I mean, any person related by blood is your immediate family. And that, it's going to cover every circumstance, but it also includes adoption, civil marriage, civil union, all the things listed here. So
I got 36 first cousins. I'm related to half the state, so that's pretty broad.
So it's going to, again, yes, sir. It's going to be relevant, but I would also highlight something for you that I feel like it's also somewhat, it has become unnecessary and moot based on an amendment from the General and Housing Committee that I raised to them, and they didn't feel it necessary to change. So I'm gonna flag an issue for you when we get there here later. Okay. Now, next section, tenant obligations to pay rent. This is a key thing on sub A. It's not new language, it's current statute language, but it's going to be relevant because we get to later when we talk about terminations because of non-payment of rent. And there's some changes regarding late payment of rent and repeated late payment of rent. And so this question, kind of somewhat comes up frequently when we discuss the changes that are being made throughout. Rent is payable without demand. So when the parties agree that this is the rent and this is the day it's due, the landlord is not required to come to you and say, remind you that rent's due or remind you that rent is late, etc. It's payable on demand without notice when it's agreed to by the parties. What is being added here in the subsection C is a landlord shall not increase rent more than once in any 12-month period. Currently, there's no limitation on that. So once within a 12-month period, that does not apply when a landlord purchases the dwelling unit. So if I'm the landlord and I raise the rent in January, and then Senator Chittenden, I sell it to you in March, and you become the owner of the property and the landlord in April, you can then raise the rent again. That 12-month period would prohibit you from doing it. But then from that point on, you wouldn't be able to raise it for another couple months.
Okay, Mr. Chair. So too frequently, even if these things are owned in like real estate investment trusts, they're not changing hands that regularly to be concerned with the ability to game the system and be able to jack rents up by changing ownership. There's transfer fees. So
the committee did not discuss that to my knowledge. That wasn't a concern that I was aware of sitting in the chair when I was there. But the concern that they were trying to address was if you have it that you can't raise it in a 12-month period, there was concern that individuals may not invest, they may not buy property if they're then prohibited from being able to raise the rent. So I'm the landlord, I purchased the property, I now have, the obligations of the mortgage on the property, etc. And if the rents that are currently in existence, aren't sufficient to cover the cost of my investment, then it's deterring my investment. And that was what the committee was trying to address.
No,
Go ahead, please.
was there any conversation in the committee about whether utilities were included in the lease and the costs associated with utilities being so volatile, especially in the circumstances that we today?
I don't remember there being any discussion specifically about inclusion of utilities, kind of about that piece in particular. There was discussion, and at one point, there were rent caps in place in the version, in different iterations of the version as the committee was working through. And there was some discussion about if someone purchases the building, they would only be able to raise the rent. It was like CPI plus a certain amount. And then there was discussion about whether to change that to allow for them to raise the rent to cover costs. And presumably costs, including things like the mortgage and utilities that they're paying for them, et cetera. There never was, at least when I was in the chair, there was never an in-depth discussion about if the rent includes things like the cost of utilities. Does this somehow preclude them if utilities are skyrocketing and then they've raised rent and now they can't raise rent again? I don't remember that being a discussion.
So if I could kind of twist the question around the other way. Is there anything in this language which would inhibit a landlord who is including utilities within the lease, inhibit them from raising the rent based on very volatile energy?
I think it would. I'm pulling up the statutory chapter because I just want to make sure, I don't recall there being a definition of rent to that level. And I just want to make sure I'm not missing something. So rent is all consideration to be paid to or for the benefit of the landlord under the rental agreement, which doesn't include the security deposit. So as I would read that, if you are including certain utilities within the rent amounts, then you would not be able to raise the rent, right? Like you raised the rent in January and, you know, unfortunately,
Somebody invades Iran.
thank you for bringing it up. I didn't have to. And energy prices skyrocket and you've included heat within the rent. I would argue you wouldn't be able to then subsequently raise it again to cover the cost for that. I just trying to figure out an artful way of expressing the hypothetical. So thank you. Okay. Now we get to residential rental applications. Currently under statute, the landlord is prohibited from charging an application fee. You can see this on the sub A here. Landlord shall not charge an application fee in order to enter into a rental agreement for the residential dwelling units. That's not defined. And so there was testimony about, well, some landlords charge application fees. They maybe they know the statute prohibits it, maybe they don't, but there are some that do charge the fee. You have to pay a $50 processing fee to submit the application. I'm making that number up. I'm just saying, you know, giving you the example. And then there's the question about things like credit check and background check. Is that considered part of the application fee? If you have to pay for it at the point of application, well, what if you pay for it at a later point when the landlord is further, you know, kind of narrowing down the list of applicants they want to move forward? And so the language here was intended to you know, clean up part of that. So you have the sub 2, which is giving the application fee a definition, any fee, charge, or cost to submit the application, including in processing payments. But then the sub 3 is saying the landlord may charge actual cost to conduct a background or a credit check, unless the tenant or the applicant provides a current credit report as part of the application, in which case the landlord shall not charge for a credit check. For purposes of the subdivision, a current credit report means a report dated within 90 days prior to the date of the application. So trying to put out.
Mean that the landlord or the tenant can come along with a piece of paper from Joe's credit reporting agency?
It's not further defined. I would say that.
See that as a real problem.
I would say that as long as it is, you know, and I'll say it's not defined.
Business opportunity.
So a few things in this section just to keep in mind. The landlord's agent may charge. It has to be for actual costs. So they wouldn't be able to charge, you know, something above that. And then if the landlord does charge, they have to provide a copy back to the individual. That's there in the sub 4. If charging for the background of credit check, the landlord shall provide a copy of it back to the individual. And then another key piece here on page 4 to be aware of is this new subsection C. A person who violates this section commits an unfair practice in commerce in violation of 2453 of this title. So that is giving the Attorney General's office and state's attorneys the authority to investigate a violation as an unfair act of commerce, and all of the, all of the authority and penalties that potentially go along with that, which could include, the Attorney General ultimately enforcing penalties. I think typically in a circumstance like this, the AG is probably gonna, go for some sort of, cease, desist, agreement with the landlord, but ultimately it could result in penalties. The individual could also bring a private right of action under the Consumer Protection Act.
Is it also then envisioned that this would protect the landlord from a practice of a falsified credit report or background check? Is it kind of a two-edged sword, or is it?
I believe so. Let me double check on that, but yes, sir. I think you're saying in the example that, we're kind of alluding to, if somebody's giving fake background checks and the landlord rents to them, and ultimately some, significant, the tenant stops paying, where if the person had provided a legitimate credit check, maybe they would have been excluded from the rental. Could the landlord super damages? Potentially, of course, keep in mind, if the individual's not paying or the individual damages the unit, the landlord's probably going after for damages and back payment of rent anyway as part of the ejectment. But yes, I do think conceptually that would be a two-way street. Let me double check.
Okay. That would be the practical fees for the landlord to go after. That's a good question.
Okay, section 4461 governs security deposits. Currently, there's no cap on security deposits. There is a lot of information in the section about when the landlord has to provide a security deposit back. What can the landlord deduct from a security deposit? The landlord has to provide a written, summary to the tenant about what is being deducted from the security deposit. Excuse me. So what this section will do is, first off, it will put a cap there in the A2, starting in lines 15. Landlord shall not charge for or receive a security deposit exceeding an amount equal to 2 months of rent, in addition to any rent for the first month paid. So when you think about it, that means first, last security deposit. My understanding from a lot of the testimony, that seems to be pretty typical. The individual would not be able to charge above that. And so you're getting the first month, for the first month you're living there, 2 months above that, that would be the cap. However, sub 3, the landlord may charge a separate security deposit in addition to the amount authorized in sub 2 as a condition for allowing the tenant to have a pet or pets during the rental period. Pet deposit excluded, not covered in the cap. There's some language there that a landlord shall not charge any amount under the subdivision for any animal that mitigates disability. You could argue that that's already covered in federal law, but just clarifying it in state law. Now we're moving on to sub 3. So this is where landlord has to return the security deposit within 14 days. And then what the sub 2 here is, later on, when we start talking about termination, there is certain periods, as I mentioned, notice that the landlord has to provide to the tenant. And what this section is saying here is, if the landlord is terminating the tenancy under subsection 4467D or E, and the best way for me to describe this is if it's essentially a no-cause termination. So it's not a termination because of non-payment of rent. It's not a termination because the tenant isn't complying with some sort of terms of the agreement, or the tenant is becoming violent or something like that. It is the landlord saying, I no longer want to extend the lease agreement with you, or, I'm wanting to terminate the agreement because there isn't a written agreement. You're in month to month, and I'm going to terminate it for no cause. I don't need a reason. I'm just giving you notice. If the landlord is terminating for one of those circumstances, not at the fault of the tenant, the landlord shall return half of the security deposit, subject to any authorized deductions, along with the statement itemizing the deductions that's already required by the statute, the landlord has to return half of the security deposit not later than 45 days before the date of termination of the notice. So later on in the section, it's extending the termination for no cause to 90 days. And halfway between that, at 45 days left before the termination of the rental agreement, the landlord has to provide the individual with half of their security deposit.
You said extending to 90 from what?
May I hold that? Sure. Get there when we get there, okay? Because it's,
Yeah.
a lot of.
Essentially, it gives the landlords 90 days to get the person out if there's no cause eviction
They have to give 90-day notice.
notice.
Yes, sir. And then halfway between 45 days, they have to give the individual half their security deposit.
After they think,
Before they leave.
or they,
Yes.
So proceed.
The way it was discussed was the notice period for all no cause evictions is being extended to the furthest amount under current statute up to 90 days. It's being all extended out to 90 days. And there was discussion about the barriers to getting a new rental agreement when you have to pay first month, last month security deposit. You have to come up with 3 months. And if you're having to move and current law says that the landlord doesn't have to return the security deposit until 14 days after you leave. And so there was discussion about the hardship for individuals in that circumstance. And so the chair proposed, what he felt was a compromise of, okay, then if somebody is under that circumstance, give them half their security deposit back so they can at least have that to help facilitate getting into it. So I think that piece was received, favorably by most on the committee, in my recollection. Okay. The sub E here is just adding in this new pet deposit piece, and this piece regarding the pay. If the landlord doesn't pay you half your security deposit 45 days before the termination notice, then the landlord forfeits the right to withhold anything from it.
that's a stupid question. Just to clarify, if the landlord commits to this project giving 90 days, the person still has to pay rent for those 90 days.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Then you're still giving back half of the money, would they just take it off of rent owed?
They could. They could. But keep in mind, you as the landlord, you have the security deposit that you're holding, and then you're still expecting the person to pay rent. So that security deposit that you're holding, you have to give back. If you wanted to say to somebody, instead of me giving you half your security deposit, I will give you, the second to last month's rent free because you've already paid for last month as part of the security or something like that.
That's not really good legal practice. I mean, we generally tend to require that security deposits remain in a separate account and, are not mixed with rent payments whatsoever.
I agree with you. Yes, ma'am. Because of the way the statutory section is written, again, the landlord is supposed to give the security deposit back within a time frame and document what is being withheld from it. So I 100% agree with the senator. It is probably not a good practice to do it that way, but conceivably, if the parties wanted to come to some sort of agreement on that, there's nothing in statute that would prohibit them doing so.
I mean, like security deposits touch down in like the uniform commercial code and things like that. So I just feel like I'm really glad it's been a long time since we talked about landlord tenant law. But in past years, we've spent a lot of time on security deposits as a transaction. That was my first bill that passed actually was editing the uniform commercial code, which we almost never do, to allow a tenant to get more of their security deposit back while they're still arguing for a portion that was withheld. But I think it would be really helpful if we all got on the same page about security deposit law. And I frankly don't think this piece involves anyone left who remembers long debates on security deposit law. And it concerns me greatly because it's a totally separate transaction, and very much legally guided. We should be reminding ourselves about the existing laws about the notice you have to give, the separate account, the accounting for security, but like this is
I know we're talking
concerning.
the bill, but if I may, so yeah, it seems to odd that if you're initiating an eviction, I'm not a landlord, I don't, but I would expect that you'd have issues with that tenant as a likely reason to give them their security deposit back while you're trying to get the vaccines.
So keep in mind that the statutory section there states that it's only under a termination under D or E, which is the so-called no cause eviction. So you're not doing it for non-payment of rent. You're not terminating for some sort of breach of the rental agreement on behalf of on the tenant. So I'm not saying that there wouldn't be any potential friction between the landlord and the tenant, because sometimes the landlord will bring a termination under multiple different reasons because they are trying to cover all bases. So you could be bringing a termination under a non-payment of rent and bringing a termination under D or E.
Still to that end, I have talked when South Burlington City Council, we were looking at a rental registry, and landlords came and talked to me, and they said we need to be able to evict somebody when their neighbors don't feel comfortable, don't want to put in writing why they don't feel comfortable because of behavior. So it still strikes me as, even with a no cause as its issues, there's reasons to eject somebody without having formal documentation as to why, and it seems odd to give back half of the security deposit during that process. I'll leave it at that.
And happy to talk about this further, but
Yeah.
ready, I'll make a note that we have discussion on this. Okay, sub 6, next section, retaliatory conduct prohibited. So this section prohibits a landlord from taking certain action based or retaliating against a tenant based on action the tenant has taken. I should state it that way. So as you can see in a sub A, if a tenant has complained to a government agency about, some sort of habitability issue, has complained to the landlord of a violation of the chapter, has organized the tenants union, etc., the landlord can retaliate against the individual by either threatening to remove them or, raising rent or etc. And the sub 4 there on line 14 is adding into that the tenant has taken any legal action authorized by law against the landlord. There was some concern among the committee about landlord harassment or, the landlord being the one engaging in some sort of violent activity or behavior. And if the tenant wanted to take some sort of, restraining order or some sort of action against the landlord in that case, adding it into the provisions here that prohibit the landlord from retaliating against the person for doing something. Page 7. Okay. Here's where we get into the termination periods. So I'm going to pause here because I had a chart that I may tweak and bring to you all to help as you guide through this. But I had a chart that showed all of the different bills that were in House General and Housing about the difference between the termination periods. Because they were looking at like 5 different bills that have been introduced addressing termination notice at some point. Currently, the termination notice period is dependent on the reason for termination. So if the landlord is terminating the rental agreement for non-payment of rent, the notice period is 14 days. So the landlord has to provide 14 days notice after the date of actual notice. And if you remember the definition of actual notice, it is hand delivered or it's mailed, and there's a rebuttable presumption that the person received it 3 days after it's mailed. So if you're the landlord, you have to calculate all of that out. I'm going to mail it today by first class mail. I can only presume that you received it 3 days after that. So I have to count 3 days, 1, 2, 3. I have to give you 14 days notice from the date you received the actual notice. So now I need to count 14 more days from there. That's the date that the rental agreement terminates. So it's 14 days for and just don't worry about the underlying language. I'm just going to run through the sections real quick. 14 days for termination for non-payment of rent. For termination of the breach of a rental agreement. So if the tenant is failing to comply with material terms of the rental agreement or with the tenant's obligations imposed by the chapter, it is 14 days. Oh, no, excuse me. It's 30 days. My apology. Under B2, when termination is based on criminal activity, illegal drug activity, acts of violence, etc., it's 14 days. So it's 14 for non-payment of rent, 14 for any sort of criminal or violent activity, 30 days for failing to comply with material terms of the rental agreement. Well, what does that mean? Well, that could be things like it's a one-bedroom apartment and your lease states that you can't allow anyone else to live there. I find out you have somebody else living there. I would argue that's a breach of the material terms of the rental agreement. That's the termination giving. The lease agreement says you can't smoke in the unit, and I find out that you're smoking. Breach of material terms, 30 days. So 14, 14, 30. But then later on, we get into what about no cause evictions? And that's what the statutory language currently uses is no cause eviction. Then it depends on, do you have a written agreement or do you not have a written agreement? That's the first question. The second question is, have you lived there for less than 2 years or have you lived there for more than 2 years? If you have a written agreement, then you've been there for less than 2 years, you have to provide 30 days notice before the end of the written agreement. So you have a 12-month lease. I'm not going to continue the rental agreement after the end of the 12 months. I have to provide you notice 30 days before the expiration of the agreement. If you've been there for 2 years or longer, it's 60 days before the end of the written agreement, right? What about if you don't have a written agreement? So you come in, your first year, the landlord gives you a lease and you sign it and it's 12 months, and then everybody forgets to renew. You keep living there, but nobody gave you a new written document. So you're just, kind of think about it as the month-to-month notice. Current law, under that case, if you've been there for less than 2 years, it's 60 days. Different than if it's in writing, right? If you've been there for 2 years or greater, it's 90 days. So my point is you have all of these different notice periods depending on the circumstance. Violent activity, non-payment of rent, 14 days. Breach of material terms, 30 days. For no cause, do you have a written rental agreement? And have you been there for less than 2 years or greater than 2 years? What this bill will do is for the termination reasons that are because the tenant is doing something wrong. So think about non-payment of rent, breach of the material terms, violent activity. For those termination periods, this proposal shortens the notice period. For all of the other notice periods, so for the quote, no cause terminations, it makes them all consistent and extends them to 90 days. So instead of having this different period, whether you have a written agreement or not a written agreement, instead of having a different period if you've been there for less than 2 years or more than 2 years, it makes all of them 90 days. So now to walk through the sections themselves, we have the subdivision A, which is about termination for non-payment of rent. There on line 7, you can see that the proposal is to reduce it from 14 days to 10 days. The next change there on lines 10, 11, and 12, I'm going to come back to in just a second. We move on to sub B. Sub B, there are two parts to sub B, B1 and B2. But the concept of the B is termination because there's some sort of breach. The tenant has breached the rental agreement in some capacity. B1, current law, landlord can terminate for failure to comply with the material terms of the rental agreement or with obligations imposed. Those are the examples I just gave you a second ago, smoking in the unit, allowing somebody else to live there, etc. The proposal here adds a few more reasons to terminate under a B1 termination. Tenants' late payment of rent more than 3 times in a 12-month period. Why does that matter? When you go back to the subdivision A, if somebody doesn't pay rent and you terminate the rental agreement because they haven't paid rent and they turn around and pay you rent, the agreement doesn't terminate. So this language on lines 8 forward says, the written rental agreement shall not terminate if the tenant pays or tenders rent to the end of the rental period in which payment is made. So the concern was you can't evict someone for repeated late payment of rent. You remember earlier when I said that rent is due without demand? So the concern that was raised is I, landlord, have to chase this tenant every month because they don't pay rent. Could be the last day of the rental period. I've already provided them a termination notice and they pay rent. It fixes the termination notice. And the next month I have to chase them again and again and again. That was the issue that the committee was discussing what and how to address. So this sub A adds some language here to say that the written rental agreement doesn't terminate if the tenant pays rent due to the end of the rental period, provided that a landlord can terminate under B1 for repeated late payment of rent. So B1 says that if an individual is late more than 3 times in the 12-month period, you can move forward with a termination under the breach of written rental agreement terms. Late payment is defined as 10 days or more after the due date of the rent. Top of page 8, adding in that the landlord can terminate for refusing to allow the landlord or the landlord agent access to the dwelling unit. There's a specific section that states when a landlord can access a dwelling unit and that the tenant cannot unreasonably withhold that access. There was some testimony amongst, providers that can become problematic and become an issue in certain circumstances. So this specifically authorizes the landlord to terminate a written rental agreement when a tenant is refusing to allow access. Under those circumstances, the committee is proposing to reduce that from 30 days to 21 days. Now we get to B2, which is the violent activity or damage. So as you can see right now, it's termination based on criminal activity, illegal drug activity, or acts of violence, any of which threaten the health or safety of other residents. There's some slight tweaking here. Removing criminal activity or illegal drug activity and just going with termination is based on an acts of violence, damage to the dwelling unit, or other activity, any of which threatens the health or safety of other residents. So I don't interpret that to say that now people can do criminal activity or illegal drug activity. I read it to say that if they're doing any activity, whether it's criminal or illegal or not, if the activity is threatening the health or safety of other residents, the landlord or the landlord's agent or neighbors, then the landlord may terminate under that circumstance. And the committee is proposing to reduce that from 14 days to 5 days. There's been a lot of discussion about this provision in particular as this bill is moving through judiciary, and it was in general at the end. Now it's moving through judiciary, and there's been some comment and discussion about it doesn't specify that the acts of violence or damage have to be the tenant. It could be the tenant's invitee, could be their guest. And there's been concern about that possibly also including some sort of domestic violence type of circumstance where the individual tenant may be hostage to someone else, or it may be another tenant who is being violent towards that individual, and is the tenant then potentially subject to termination and an ejectment based on violent activity of somebody else. I would argue the reading of this section is yes. So there's just a policy question of whether that's something that the body wants to address. So just flagging it for you now as you're thinking about the bill moving forward, that's something that has continued to come up.
This is 2A you're referring to?
Yes, sir. Yes. 2B is being added to say that actual notice required under this subsection shall be accompanied by an affidavit setting forth particular facts, the basis thereof, in support of the termination with sufficient details to inform the tenant of the reasoning behind the termination. Landlord needs to give you facts as to why they're terminating you under B2A because they're claiming that activity that you're doing is threatening other people.
Can you characterize the affidavit versus
This piece here.
the others? From a legal perspective, what's that process? Like, how long is that process taking? Is it expensive? Give us some background.
So that was some discussion from the court. Judge Zone pointed out, is there going to be an issue if a landlord provides an affidavit and ultimately moves to an ejectment? And what if the court feels like the affidavit isn't setting forth particular facts with sufficient detail? Is that somehow going to be problematic? I would say that that's going to be on a case-by-case basis. This isn't a legal document. You know, you don't necessarily have to go to an attorney to get an affidavit. You know, we can take that word out if that would help, you know, clarify. The 2A termination can be based on one instance, one event. It could be if, you know, some of the scenarios that were discussed, you know, were situations where the tenant becomes violent and, you know, physically threatens people, threatens to kill them, or pulls out a knife on them, something to that effect. That one instance, you know, you write up a document, you know, articulating the circumstance that occurred, I would argue that would be sufficient.
If I may, so a concern I will raise as this discussion goes forward, in those circumstances, what I remember a couple of landlords said, if the neighbor of this problematic tenant is the one who feels threatened, and they have to continue to live next door to that threatening individual, they very often will not put anything in writing because they don't want to know that they're the ones that are asking. And that's why no cause eviction, the landlord still needs to say, listen, I need you out. I can't tell you why. I'm not
That's a 90-day process. It's contemplated 5 days.
Yes. Yes, sir. And agreed. A lot of that testimony was provided, and, you know, I would defer to the external stakeholders as to whether or not they feel some of the things here would address that. I don't necessarily know that it does. I think you're always going to continue to run into the issue of the landlord may not be present when things are occurring. That may, you know, result in a justification for termination under 2A. And in that event, if the other parties are not willing to speak up and provide the information to be able to move forward, you know, I don't know how you legally get around that circumstance. The reason the B was here is the committee felt that, and I don't mean to speak for the committee, but, you know, they're trying to balance that with the fact that the tenant if you're shortening the time frame, especially down to 5 days, you know, the tenant needs to understand what are the justifications for you terminating my rental agreement and giving me 5 days to leave in order to be able to exercise their rights in case they disagree with the reasoning behind the termination. And, you know, because the process is being somewhat, I don't want to use the word expedited, it's a policy decision for you all as to whether it's an appropriate time frame, but because the timeframes are proposed to be shortened in this bill, making sure that the tenant had adequate information up front about what the facts that the landlord thinks are sufficient and support the termination, getting that to them early was kind of the thought process here. So, Senator Weeks, I mean, I will just kind of somewhat echo a point that you made. And I think it may be best a question for Judge Zone. He testified both in House General and in House Judiciary, and I would recommend and assume that you all would have him in here as well. He did raise some discussion about the language in this subdivision. It is mirroring some language that is in the ejectment process now, but he did raise kind of a similar comment of just, you know, what exactly does this mean? And, you know, if a landlord writes down on a piece of paper, you know, a 2-sentence response, you know, you threatened Senator Chittenden and that's it without any further information. Is that, you know, particular facts with sufficient detail? And that may be something that the court just works out on a case by case basis.
But it'd be interesting if there is any case law on the subject.
And I imagine they're so fact specific that I doubt there is any, task that the court should do. Okay.
The issue of affidavit, normally I think of affidavit, I think of that as a sworn statement. As defined. Is that what's intended here?
It's not defined.
So it doesn't define affidavit directly.
And to that point, if you're seeking, you know, some sort of clarification and less burden, you know, potentially on the landlord, like the landlord reads that and thinks, okay, no, you know, I do need to go to get an attorney, and is that going to take me time and money and all of that? You know, I don't know that the committee was you know, necessarily honed in or wed to that word, so it could just be a written statement. You know, that way it's clear to the landlord that you don't have to go through that process. You just need to provide something in writing, articulating the justifications of it.
Yes, sir. This could be titled, how to convince yourself never to come land.
Yeah, that's exactly what.
It's a headache here.
Okay, important is this sub 3 here. And before I get there, let me just comment. There's a statutory provision, 18 VSA 4254, and it provides certain protection to individuals from, you know, criminal liability in the event that the person is, starting on lines 19 here, seeking medical assistance for a drug overdose, is the subject of a good faith request for medical assistance because of a drug overdose, or because the person is at the scene of a drug overdose or within close proximity of a scene. Under those circumstances, 18 VSA 4254, and I can pull it up and we can walk through it if you all would find that helpful at some point, but there's certain, you know, protection from criminal liability in those circumstances. You know, I was not around when that was drafted and passed, you know, so I'm you know, probably not the best person to speak to what is the thought or reasoning behind it, but I think just on its face, you know, you want people to seek medical attention when somebody is having a drug overdose. And so the section is there to try to incentivize that. If somebody is overdosing, for the individuals who are there to seek medical attention. And if you're doing that, then we're not going to hold you criminally liable for the evidence gathered, you know, in relation to the drug overdose itself. So it may be worth it to just pull that section up and take a look at it. If you have questions or want to kind of dive further on this section. What this is stating is kind of similar to what's in 184254. The landlord shall not terminate a rental agreement based on a person seeking medical assistance, being the subject of good faith request, or being at the scene or within close proximity of a drug overdose as provided in 18 BSA 4254, and evidence obtained from a good faith request for medical assistance for a drug overdose shall not be used in an ejectment action fraud. So, Senator, I'll just use the example, Senator Chidman, you're in my apartment across the hall from you. I have a drug overdose. You call the police show up, and now the landlord wants to eject you because you've engaged in activity that's threatening other people in the property. The landlord would not be able to do that under this scenario.
I get the intent and I'm supportive of in an isolation. My worries are, what if this is happening once a week? There's a pattern of sorts. Is every single one of those instances not considerable for that termination?
I think that's a good question. A question I don't recall having come up in the House General Committee. So something I would want to think about. Right off the top of my head, I think in every instance it wouldn't be authorized. So you may want to think about adding something that indicates that there's some sort of repeated pattern of behavior. But let me review the language again just to make sure that would be my final.
Thanks, sir. So I'm curious how the House Committee found balance between the landlord and the tenant in this case, given the scenario we saw one with Senator Chidman.
I would probably defer that question to them. There was, I recall many members of the committee feeling that, when you go back up to the 2A, right now it's criminal activity and illegal drug activity. And now, even though those words are being struck, you're still keeping the activity which threatens others. So as it was articulated by certain members of the committee, they wanted to address the drug dealing, but didn't want to necessarily address the circumstance where somebody may be in their home using drug activity solely by themselves that isn't impacting other people in the unit. And I understand that is a policy decision, and many different opinions could exist on whether or not somebody doing drug activity in their unit is threatening other people, or what are the consequences of that activity. So policy decision, I will just say, at least from the statements of some of the members of the committee in adding this in, it was intended to not impact the individual who may be using drugs within their own unit who isn't disturbing other individuals around. They were trying to address the circumstances where there was drug sales, etc. That because it's probably not that so concerned. Okay, it's 10:51. I'm going to keep going until you guys.
Let's go to 5.
Yep. Okay, I think I can probably at least get to this section.
Okay.
So A and B are really being kept in their current construct. A is for non-payment of rent. B is for, other, breach of the terms that the tenant is engaging in activity that's breaching the rental agreement terms. There's some changes, but the A and the B are really being kept structurally as they currently exist. The rest of this section, you look at C. C is currently under the statute, termination for no cause in the absence of a written rental agreement. And then you have to go all the way down to E to get to termination for no cause under a written rental agreement. And then you have subsection D, where the termination is for the property being sold. All of these are somewhat being just kind of restructured a little bit, if you will. So C is going to change into termination for tenant or government notice to vacate. And this is if the tenant gives actual notice and says, I'm vacating the property on this day, the landlord can turn around and say, your agreement ends on that day. And that's the day that it ends. And it doesn't need to be 90 days into the future or 2 weeks into the future. If the tenant provides a date that they're moving out, landlord can terminate the rental agreement on that date. Then
If it is a lease, does the landlord have to terminated on that.
No,
At least
and if,
presumably the same place.
if the tenant abandons the location, then in theory, they're still on the hook for the rent during that period.
In the period that addresses that.
There's a provision in current law that talks about that, and I can pull it up and we can walk through it. Practically, whether the landlord goes after somebody in that circumstance, different question, but yes, sir, there is a section. The two here is when termination is based on compliance with a government order. Termination date is the date that's in the government order. The government order says you need to vacate this property on this date. The landlord doesn't need to wait 90 days or 30 days or whatever. It's on the date that's provided in the government.
That presumably with it has an expectation of what kind of government order would be able to do that.
Yes, sir. I mean, I think the tenant could argue that the government order isn't a valid government order. Yes, sir. So now we get to, I think,
Just curious.
I personally haven't seen it, but I think somebody could argue it, you know, if
There's a highway coming through.
you could argue some sort of eminent domain, or somebody could challenge an eminent domain, you know, proceeding. I'm thinking more in the sense of, let's say the government says the building isn't habitable anymore and, you know, wants to terminate based on that. Or my immediate reaction was thinking about, you know, there were a lot of government orders during the pandemic, you know, some of which people challenged because they didn't feel like they were valid exercises of the government's power. So, I do think that just a tenant could make a case that the government order is invalid and make an argument there.
I'm afraid we're going to have to end now, even though it may be early because the bell is ringing despite the fact that it's early on my clock.
We spent almost an hour and we got through a third of the bill almost. So
Well done.
making good progress.
Absolutely. Looking forward to the rest. Listen, set aside the next week for that.
I obliged you for this.